Have you ever wanted to make cool death effects like this? Well, if so, then you're in luck, because today I'll be going over everything from creating the effect, making the mechanic inverse, and even allowing players to unlock and equip different effects. If you want to skip the tutorial, you can find all of the code and assets in our Discord, which will be linked in the description below. But before we get into the tutorial, I first want to take a moment to tell you about this awesome program we've created. If you haven't heard of it already, it's called the Map Creator Success Program, and it is the best service out there for map creators. So far, we've helped over 200 creators build better maps and make tens, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars in the process. We do this by combining tons of different tools and services all into this one ultimate package that is the Creator Success Program. So if you're a map creator and you want to take the next step in making maps, then check it out. It'll be in the description below. All right, so to get started, the first thing you'll need to create a elimination effect is the effect itself. So let me go ahead and run you through this simple one that I went ahead and already created. I'm not going to explain everything inside of it because ultimately each death effect is going to be different, but I'll go through and explain to you everything I did in this effect specifically to create this gold coin kind of animation. So to create an effect, you want to hit right click and hit Niagara system, and as a base for it I'm going to use directional burst and then hit create. I'm going to title this coin explosion VFX and then open it up. Alright, well, now that we have this, the first thing we need to do is change the direction of the burst because we want this to explode upward instead of to the side. And to do that, we'll go to add velocity, and here on our cone axis, instead of facing the x-axis like we have here, we want to instead face the z-axis or upwards, so we'll change that to 1, and now it is exploding upwards. Next up, we're going to go ahead and turn these little particle things into our actual coins. And to do that, I'll go down here to our render and add a mesh render. Go ahead and disable your sprite renderer. Then for the mesh, we're going to go ahead and select whatever mesh we're going to use. Here, I'm just going to use a cylinder, but this is probably where you're going to want to import your own custom mesh or create one. Have it be whatever you want. For example, a little coin prop or something, but I'll just use a cylinder for this. And you can see all of the particles are now cylinders, but that's not what we want. So we'll go ahead and go to where our particles are initialized. And whenever they're initialized, we want to change the size of them. So I'll go for the mesh scale mode and set this to non-uniform. Then I can now change the scale of each of these. So the X and Y, I'll go 0.3, 0.3, and for this I'll go 0.1. So now they kind of look about the shape of a coin. And the next thing I'll do is go back down to my mesh renderer, enable material override, add a new material, and then I'll change this to some gold material like that. If you have your own cylinder or your own coin mesh here that already has a material on it, you won't need to do this. Next up is we want these to stop whenever they hit the ground, so we want to add collision. So we'll go to our particle update and type in collision, then add that. Alright, so as you can see, there's now collision and they're stopping. But you might want to mess around with some of the other settings, like for example the restitution. This is going to be the bounce. So if you don't want any bounce, you'll set this to 0 so that it all stops. And then maybe the friction, if you don't want them to slide at all, increase this. Or if you want a lot of slide, you can decrease this. So if we do 0.01, you'll see they'll slide a little more. But if we go 1, they're gonna not slide at all. And then you can mess around with some of the other stuff, like how many particles. You can go to the spawn burst instantaneous. You can make it so there's only 5, or you can make it so there's 2,000. But I think around 100 is a good amount, maybe a little less, like 50. And then the last thing I'm going to add is I don't want them all to start from a singular point. I want them to be more spread out. So I'm going to go to particle spawn, and then I'm going to add a shape location. And this will just allow me to change where that spawns. You want to make sure that this is added before add velocity. And then in this, I'm just going to keep it to sphere because I think that looks the best. But if you want to change this to something else, like maybe a ring or disc, you can do that as well. So it kind of surrounds the player, but I'm going to go with sphere. And because I'm doing that, I'm also going to turn up the particle amount by a little more. I'll just go back to the original 75. And with that, I'm now going to go ahead and compile, hit save, and my effect is done. So we have this coin explosion VFX that whatever we throw onto the ground here, if I go like so, you can see some of them went through the ground, but what we can do is move this up to the sky. Then go ahead and open your effect. And if I kind of minimize this tab here, then select it and press spacebar, it'll play in game. So whenever I press space, it plays and everything lands automatically. The only other thing that I think needs to be changed before we actually use this is probably the lifetime. So we want to go here to our initialized particle and probably increase the lifetime max and the min by a little bit. So say the minimum is 1 second and the max is 2.5. So that they sit on the ground for a little bit longer. Compile, save, minimize the tab, and now they'll actually sit on the ground for a couple seconds before they eventually go away. Now that we have this effect, I'll go ahead and close this out, delete the effect, and create a blueprint class with a building prop, and I'll call this our coin VFX blueprint, like so. Open it up, go ahead and drag your new effect into it, and then hit compile and save. There's nothing else you need to do in this, but now we actually have this prop which we can instead use, and this will allow us to combine with verse to create our elimination VFX. So let's do that. First, go to verse explorer, then right click on your project name and create a new verse file, which I'll name our elimination effect manager, and hit create. Save selected. Once this has been created, I'll double click to open it up. In this, there's two ways we can track elimination. One is strictly by using built-in verse functions, or the other is the elimination manager, which will also work, but I'm going to use built-in verse functions for this. So I need to track every single player who joins the game, as well as any of the players who are in the game whenever the game starts. We'll start with the players who are in the game. I'll go through every single current player by saying get play space dot get players. This will get all of the players in the current game. And for all of these players, I am going to call a function called track elim and send the player I just got. Now I'll go down here and make that function called track elim. It will take in a player like so, and it doesn't need to return anything. I'm going to put a block in this for now, and that's just because I also want to account for join in progress players. So I'll write get play space dot player added event dot subscribe track elim, like so. This will now activate this function for all new players who join the game. So now what I need to do is make a loop that waits for this player to get eliminated. But if we try to do a loop here, it is not going to work because this function does not suspend. So what we need to do is create a new function and call that. Go down here and say track elim2 and then copy all of this, except here we need to make sure it suspends. And then inside of this, I'll just spawn track elim2 and send our player. So all this does is act as a little gateway function in order for this to be able to suspend. Because if we make this suspends instead, then this subscribe will no longer work. Anyways, now that we have this loop, we need to go ahead and wait for our player to get eliminated inside of it. But to do that, we need to get the for character. So I'll say if our for character is equal to player.get fort character, like so. Here we're going to get an error. That's because we need to use Fortnite.com/characters. So I'll copy and paste that up top. Now that we have our for character, we can go inside our loop and write for character dot eliminated event dot await, like so. So whenever the player is eliminated, we now need to show the effect. So to do that, we're going to spawn a prop in at the player's location and then dispose it in a couple seconds, and that prop will be our effect prop that we created earlier. To reference that, I'll make an editable and call it our gold effect prop of type creative prop asset, because we want to actually spawn it in, and you initialize assets with a default creative prop asset, like so. So now that we have this asset, we can go ahead and spawn it in at the player's location. But to do that, I'm actually going to use a different function. So I'll say spawn play effect at, and then I'll send our for character so that it knows what player to play the effect at. So now I'll get on here and create this function, which is called player effect at. It'll take in a fort character. We want it to suspend and return nothing, like so. So we'll say our player position is equal to fort character dot get transform dot translation. So this will get the fort character's position. Now we'll spawn in our prop at that position. So we'll say spawn prop first in this spawn prop function. If we go and search for it inside of our digest, we have where it takes in the asset and then transform, or it can take in the asset and then a position and a rotation. Because the transform's easier, I'm actually just going to go up here and remove this translation, so we just get the transform. And now in this spawn prop, first we'll do our creative prop asset, then put a comma and write our player's transform, which is called player position. But we actually need access to the prop that we just spawned. And if we look at this spawn prop function, it actually returns that, but it returns that in the form of a tuple, where the first element is a optional creative prop, and then the second is the spawn prop result, so whether or not it even spawned in the first place. But we want this one, so we first are going to say our new prop is equal to this result, except to get the first element in that tuple out of the two, we're going to put 0. If we wanted the spawn prop result, we put 1, and we put it in parentheses afterward. But because this is an optional, we also want to convert that, which means we need to put this in an if statement, and we also need to put a question mark at the end, which will convert that optional. So we now have the prop that was just spawned. So all we want to do is sleep for a couple seconds, let's say 3, and then dispose of that new prop by writing new prop dot dispose. This is so we don't have a bunch of different props just sitting around the map after they've been spawned in. We want to make sure to clean that up. And boom, this will now work. But there's one more thing that I want to do before we test this for the first time, and that is make sure that we end this loop that waits for the player to die whenever the player actually leaves the game. So to do that, we will race, make sure this loop is underneath it, make sure this loop is in a block, like so, and then we'll go up here and make another block with another loop where we track whenever a player leaves the game by writing get play space dot player removed event dot await, like so. We'll say that whatever player left is called our leaving player, and then if our leaving player just so happens to be the player that this loop is running for, then we'll break the loop, which will then end this entire block of code, which will then end everything else that's underneath our race, which includes this other loop that we have down here. And the reason we did this is so that if, let's say, the lobby is open for 5 hours and hundreds of different players join and leave, we don't want these loops just waiting for all of those different players. So with that, let's go ahead and test it out. We'll go into UEFN, adverse build verse code, go to your content browser, and now you'll have the elimination effect manager, which you can drag down. Then you can select your prop here. So I'll search for my coin VFX BP and select it. And that's all we need to do here. So I'm just going to go ahead and launch session to test this out. All right, so now in game, if I go ahead and start it, whenever I respawn, I should have a death effect play. Yep, as you can see, the coins appear. And then this should continue to happen every single time I am eliminated. Perfect. But what if we want different effects to play for different players, and we want them to be able to purchase and equip their own? Well, we'll need to do that in verse. So I'm going to end game and open up our verse code. So in order to be able to have each player have their own elimination effect, then we're going to need a way to track different effects for each player. And to do that, we'll use a custom player map. So we'll go up here and create a new class, which I'll call our player effects, let's say, like so. And you initialize it like any other class with this syntax. Inside of this, each of these will have a player that's assigned to it. And then we'll also create a variable, which will be the player's equipped VFX. And we'll actually make this an integer just so it's easier to work with. Now that we have this, we're going to want to actually go and assign one of these classes to each of the players whenever they join. So we're already tracking whenever players join in this track elim function. So I'll go ahead and actually use this. Actually, before I do this, we need to create the player map. So I'll say var our player map is of type a map where the key is a player and it leads to our player effects class, like so. So what this does is it holds a player effects that will correspond with a player all inside of this, and then you can add as many as you'd like. So now down here in our track elim function, I'll say if not player map player. So if the player is not already inside of the player map, then we want to add them to the player map. So I'll say if set player map player equal to player effects, where the player is equal to player that is getting initialized. And then at the end of this statement, we need to close it off. So I'll just put some curly brackets like this. So, and with that, the player is now initialized, but we need a way to be able to change this value for the player. And to do that, we're going to make our own custom class where we can assign each trigger to a specific value, which will then get assigned to the player whenever the trigger is triggered. So I'll say our VFX equippers, and I'll initialize it as a class. And I'm going to make sure this is concrete because we're going to have editables inside of it. And in here, I'll just make an editable trigger device like so. And then a VFX index, which is of type int. And then in here, I will make an array of these. So I'll say our equippers of type VFX equippers and initialize it with an array. And I also did just realize it kind of makes more sense here to instead replace this integer with instead a creative prop asset. So I'll say our player's equipped VFX is actually going to be a creative prop asset, which I'll initialize with the default. And then in here, we'll just copy and paste this editable, and instead we'll just call this our effect prop. That's going to give us an error down here, but I'll just go ahead and comment this out for now because we'll go back and change this later. So instead of using integers, we're going to be using the exact prop. So now that we have this array of different equippers where each of them have a trigger and a prop, we need to actually make them do something. So under on begin, I'll go down here and say for every single equipper in equippers, we need to say equipper dot trigger dot triggered event dot subscribe, and the function we're subscribing to is going to be inside of the equipper. So I'll say equipper dot change effect like so. Now let's go ahead and create that up here in our class. So I'll say change effect. And because this is a trigger, it returns an optional agent. So I'll write that. And this function will return nothing. Then inside of this, I'll just really quickly convert this optional agent back to a normal agent. And now we're going to need to change the prop asset inside of our player effects for this agent that we have. But how do we access it? Well, we need to access this player map, but we don't have access to this player map inside of this function here. So the best way to get access to that is actually to make a variable inside of our equipper, and it'll be our elimination effect manager of type elimination effect manager. So this will now be able to reference our main device, which has the player map inside of it. So now that we can use this, I'll go down here and say if our PE for player effects is equal to our elimination effect manager dot player map for our agent. So this is now referencing the player effects class here. We're now going to set this player equipped effects, set our PE dot players equipped VFX equal to whatever the effect prop that is selected in this equipper. But there is one issue with this, is that this can actually be any elimination effect manager. It's not necessarily this specific one which has our player map inside of it. So what we need to do is whenever we initialize all of our equippers, we need to set the equipper dot elimination effect manager equal to the actual creative device that we have here. And to reference itself, we'll just write self, like so. So now that we have a way to get players to equip different effects, we need to actually make the effect that's shown be the effect of the eliminating player. We need to get the player who killed the player who died. So we'll look in our eliminated event, and you can see it returns this elimination result, which tells us what our eliminated character is, or the player who killed the player who died. So we'll say our elim result is equal to that result that gets returned. And here, instead of sending our for character, I'll just go ahead and send the elim result and make sure to change this from a for character to elimination result. But in order to use this, we actually need to specify that we are using fortnite.com/game. So I'll just copy and paste that up top. Then now, inside of this function, I'll say our dead FC is equal to elim result dot eliminated character, and then our killer for character is equal to our elim result dot eliminating character. This, however, is an optional. If we look at our elimination result, this is an optional for character, and that's just because it's not always a player who kills another player. It could be the environment or something, and in that case this would be false. So we need to check if that is true, and to do that we'll actually put this in an if statement and put a quotation mark at the end. So now that we have the killer for character as well as the dead for character, I'm going to go ahead and comment this. But we can now get the effect of this killer for character. So we'll first need to get the agent. So I'll say if the killer agent is equal to killer for character dot get agent, like so. Then we need to get the player effects of that player. So we'll access our player map. If our killer player effects is equal to player map killer agent. And now that we have our player effects for our killer player, we can now access this player equip VFX. So I'll uncomment all of this, press tab a couple times, so it's under our if statements, and then just change these out. So instead of the gold effect prop, we'll spawn in our killer player effects dot whatever the player equipped VFX is. And then the player position is going to be our dead for characters position, like so. And with that, we now have a script that's going to allow players to equip different elimination effects, and whenever they eliminate other players, the effect they have equipped will spawn on that dead player's body. So let's go ahead and set this up. I'll go into UEFN, hit verse, build verse code. And now in our elimination manager, we'll have an array of equippers. And in each of these, we have a trigger and an effect prop. So I'll go ahead and grab a trigger device and drag it into the play space. I'll call this my effect 1 or effect trigger 1, and then duplicate this. Now I'm going to go back into my equippers and select this trigger, and then select my gold or my coin VFX blueprint. Then I'm going to create a second equipper, select this trigger again, and I'm going to create a new VFX really quickly by duplicating my existing one, and then going in here to the mesh renderer and just changing the color. I'll make this one blue, wait for this to load for a second, then hit compile and save. We're going to want to make a new blueprint for it, so I'll also copy my blueprint, go into here and change the effect to my new effect. It seems like the material did not apply correctly, so I'm going to go ahead and make sure that is, or maybe change it to another one, and that looked like it worked, so I'll make sure to save this. And then for my second effect prop, I'll select this different blueprint that I just created, and with both these equippers set up, I'll now push changes. So now in game, if I hit this first trigger and then respawn, it's going to be the gold coins. But if I go and hit the other trigger and then respawn again, we'll get the textureless coins. So it looks like that other material didn't apply correctly, but it is playing the other VFX, which is what we wanted. There's one quick thing that I forgot about, which I want to go back and fix now, and that is what happens if the player doesn't have any equipped, because right now it's just going to spawn a block where they are, which is not what we want. So I'll actually make this a optional creative prop asset, which I'll set to false. And because this is an optional, whenever we assign it, we need to assign it an optional. So I'll make this effect prop an option like so. And then down here, when this spawns, we first need to check if the killer PE.player equipped VFX, and then put a quotation mark and call this VFX is equipped and assign that to it, add the colon at the end, tab everything underneath it, and then replace this with that new VFX is equipped. So now if the player doesn't have any VFX equipped at the start of the game, then no VFX will spawn. And with that, you now know how to create death effects in UEFN. If you found this tutorial helpful and you want to support us in creating more awesome tutorials just like this one, like and subscribe, and comment what you want us to make a tutorial on next. Also, don't forget to check out Map Academy in the description below. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.